Hi, my name is Darren Jaquist. I am a master's student with Buena Vista University. This is Veterans and Suicide, What the Research Really Tells Us. This information was compiled as part of a project I did for a research methods class. It is mostly a literature review, but it has some anecdotes and context from my own service in the U.S. Army. Briefly about me, as I mentioned, I'm a master's student at Buena Vista. I have a JD from Drake University 2000. I graduated from the Judge Advocate General's Legal Center and School in 2005. That is essentially the Army's law school. I spent 10 years in the U.S. Army. 5 years of those were active duty. I was a military prosecutor, among other things, and I practiced law for almost 20 years. This issue of military suicide is particularly important to me because in my time as a military prosecutor, I was responsible for not just prosecuting crimes, but also administratively removing soldiers from the service for other misconduct. And what I frequently saw was a lot of these service people had underlying mental health issues that were perhaps undiagnosed or underdiagnosed or underreported substance use issues. And after I got out, I wanted to spend time helping them instead of prosecuting them or pursuing disciplinary action. So that's why I'm here. So how this issue became really important to me, or part of it, is I stumbled across that 22 a day from the very first slide, and I did some quick math at 20 a day for 20 years, and the numbers were just staggering. I couldn't believe it. I did the math a couple of times. And the first thing that popped into my mind when I saw those numbers was this is more than double than the number of people killed in the Vietnam War. And there were protests and there was civil unrest. And we're not we're not seeing that type of public outcry about the military suicide problem. Um, Another thing I want to point out, and this is emphasized in a lot of the studies, is that PTSD is not the only problem here. In fact, that's just a small part of the problem. And I talk more about that later in the other slides. And like with everywhere else where you see suicide as a problem, even in the military, it is a fatal outcome of psychiatric illness. Okay, a few notes. I want to be clear that PTSD is a serious problem within our military population. I'm not suggesting that it's not. It's just a small portion of the overall suicide problem with military and veterans. And so if you're looking for an issue to study, I have a slide later where there are gaps in the literature, so I'll cover that. Another thing I want to point out is although I think the Department of Defense is engaged in spin and some pretty significant spin on the suicide problem, I don't think that they're lying. And I do think they're a bit disingenuous about the security clearance issue, which I talk a little bit about later on, security clearance and reporting mental health within the military. And lastly, the military is not at fault for soldier and service member misconduct. And I want to talk quickly about that because I did have somebody, I gave a talk at an AA meeting, and a veteran came up to me afterwards when I talked about, hey, I want to help people, not prosecute them. He said, hey, you know what? The military never made me drink alcohol. It never made me use any substances. I did that on my own. So I'm not suggesting that the military is at fault. I just think that the culture enables it and doesn't do enough to help them. Okay, so let's talk about what we know. Here's where I'm going to be a little bit critical of the Department of Defense again. This quote I have up here comes from their most recent annual report on suicide. That comes from the calendar year 2019 annual suicide report. And I'm not going to try to read many slides, but I want to read this quote out loud. At first, the military suicide rate appears to be higher than the U.S. population. However, the military and U.S. populations vary considerably by age and sex, two factors associated with suicide risk. After controlling for these differences, CY 2019 active component and National Guard rates were comparable to the U.S. population rates, while the reserve rate is lower. So essentially, the Department of Defense is saying, oh, and I have up there, every life lost is a tragedy. And I added, but that's not a direct quote. They do say that every life lost is a tragedy. And they say, but when you control for all these other things, it's really about the same as the US population. And I'm not a mathematician nor a statistician. I didn't go in and double check their numbers or figure out exactly how they were spinning it that way. But what I can tell you is that pretty much no one else would agree that it's about the same as the US population. Almost every other resource that I found that put a number on the veteran and military service member suicide rate, it's anywhere from 1.5 to 2 times as likely before you add in other risk factors. Some statistics on the issue, as I mentioned, roughly 20 suicides per day since 2001. Anywhere from 1.5 to twice as likely to die by suicide are veterans and military service members. It's the fourth leading cause of death for the age range of 18 to 25. It's the 10th leading cause of death overall in the United States. Here's a couple of statistics that I want to highlight quickly. The suicide rates for the 18 to 34 range are rising, and even the Department of Defense doesn't deny that. They're in agreement that that number is going up. They're also in agreement that the rate of suicides is highest those 55 and older. So those two statistics in combination with each other are kind of alarming, because you've got the highest number in the younger people going up, and then you've got more than half of the older people already dying by suicide. And we know that the total number of vets are declining. So the fact that some of these numbers are going up while the total numbers are going down, also distressing numbers. And quickly, I'll just add here that if I realize the nomenclature has changed to dying by suicide. If I slip up and use the word commit, I apologize. I realize it's important to not use that terminology, especially with my background in criminal law. So my apologies if I slip. This slide is perhaps the most sobering slide. It has the biggest font of any of my slides for a reason. When you add in any comorbid psychiatric illness, PTSD, major depressive disorder, generalized anxiety disorder, the numbers show that they can be up to 6 times higher with military service members. And we do know that a lot of military service members have comorbidities. And the next number, if you add in substance use disorder on top of any of those other ones I mentioned, like PTSD, major depression, generalized anxiety, bipolar, any other psychiatric illness, and then if you add substance use disorder, it's up to 15 times higher for the veteran population. So really startling numbers. Factors that relate to suicidality in the veteran population include depression. Among the underlying life issues that are happening among the veteran population are one of the studies I read referred to them as routine life issues. Another study called them adjustment problems, and they're essentially common life problems such as relationship problems, financial issues, substance use, that maybe it doesn't rise to the level of SUD, but these are, the military in that sense is a microcosm of society as a whole. These are young women and men who have a lot of the same problems that everybody else does, and this factors into the next thing when I'm talking about warrior ethos. At least one of the studies I read talked about the warrior mentality of never being weak and never admitting weakness and these things, and they internalize that, and so as part of that they don't get help, they don't want to admit they need help, and as I don't need to tell you all are professionals or studying to be professionals. This is a recipe for disaster. When you have those kind of problems, you refuse to admit that you have them. Other underlying factors that seem to be common are loneliness and hopelessness, lack of access to mental health care. A lot of veterans have access to firearms. They, as a population, have a tendency to be pro-firearm. So a lot of them have privately owned firearms, and untreated comorbidities. It's a serious problem because, like I mentioned with the security clearance issue, a lot of these people These young women and men are not getting the treatment they need while they're in the service, and they come out and they perhaps needed some help and they didn't want to have to mark on their security clearance form that they'd gotten it, so they don't get it. So some thoughts on what works. It does appear that a strong therapeutic alliance works really well. One study, the Montrose study, which was a qualitative study, showed that the single biggest thing that veterans themselves reported as helping them was empathy, compassion, and listening. So that goes a long way. And that factors right in. I put humanism and existentialism right there. Existentialism focuses a lot on meaning and hopelessness. Hopelessness is a common theme that I've seen in these various studies. CBT techniques have been shown to work with the veteran population. I put Brian up there, but it's more than Brian. If you go into and you read some of the studies from my references list, you'll see that that is the most commonly cited technique with a sound evidentiary basis. What I want to focus on from this slide is that if you are seeing a veteran, not to assume that their mental health issues have anything to do with combat. Most veterans do not ever see any combat, and most of their mental health issues have nothing to do with combat. And they also have a sense of survivor's guilt that they're not worthy of getting mental health treatment, especially if you approach it with assuming that they did have some combat experience. That, in my opinion, makes them all the more likely not to want to share because they don't feel worthy of the help, that those who did see combat are the ones who are worthy of the help. Knowledge gaps for future study. I found not very many qualitative studies, not very many longitudinal studies. A lot of studies cited the lack of culturally specific or gender specific data on veterans issues. If you're looking at an area where there's not a lot, all of those areas are ripe for further research. Here are some important resources I recommend. The Veterans and Military Crisis Line. There's the 800 number up there. You can text 838-255. The National Suicide Prevention Hotline is, interestingly, the same number as the Veterans and Military Crisis Line. I didn't call it because I didn't want to use up the resources, but I double checked it and that number is the same. Here are some more resources that I recommend. I'll focus your attention on that bottom one, which you can find through the one right above it, the mentalhealth.va.gov. But that military culture course modules, this is fantastic training to teach you about military culture. So if you have a lot of veterans that you're treating, I would highly recommend watching one of these videos to learn. If you don't have military experience yourself, it would be very beneficial to learn. They're not that long. I think they're about an hour long a piece, and it's a great primer on the issue of military suicide and military culture. These are my references. I have several pages worth of references. I hope they'll be available to you if you want them. If they're not, then you can email me and I'll be happy to send my references out. Second slide. Next slide. And next. Second to last slide. And the last slide.